The air backstage at Lakewood Church buzzed with an uneasy tension. The sprawling church, filled with tens of thousands of faithful followers, hummed with an energy that only a mega-church like this could generate. Security guards in dark suits, their eyes sharp, patrolled the area, ensuring that everything ran smoothly. In the center of it all stood Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, a man whose reputation for unwavering integrity and justice had taken him to the Senate and beyond. But today, Kennedy wasn't here to discuss policies or legislation. He was here to confront something far bigger: the system of prosperity theology that had taken root in Lakewood Church. Kennedy stood backstage, waiting for his cue. His calm, steady presence contrasted sharply with the tension in the room. He wasn't nervous. He had spent decades in politics, facing down opposition with conviction and clarity. But this wasn't a typical political battle. This was a confrontation with something he believed was a grave injustice: the exploitation of the vulnerable under the guise of faith. Behind the smooth sermons, the promises of prosperity, and the grandiose claims of divine favor, Kennedy knew there was a darker truth, a truth that was hidden behind the glitz and glamour of the church's ministry. As the minutes ticked by, Kennedy's thoughts drifted to the countless stories he had uncovered in preparation for this moment. Stories of elderly women, like Margaret Chen, who had given everything they had in the hope of receiving a divine blessing, only to be left destitute and alone. The images of their struggles, their sacrifices, haunted him. Margaret's story, in particular, weighed heavily on his heart. She had sent her last Social Security check to Lakewood, believing that her faith would unlock the blessings she had been promised. But instead, she died in a cold apartment, her utilities shut off, her faith shattered. This was more than a political mission. This was a moral imperative. Kennedy wasn't just a senator today. He was a voice for those who had been silenced, a defender of truth in a place where it had long been obscured. When the head of security approached him, his expression professional yet tense, Kennedy knew that the battle was about to begin. But there was no turning back now. He had prepared for this moment, and nothing was going to stop him from delivering the message that so many had been denied. As the security guard's voice crackled over his earpiece, John Kennedy's mind was elsewhere. He wasn't thinking about the grandiose stage, the 50,000 people waiting for Joel Osteen's latest sermon, or even the millions of viewers watching the broadcast. He was thinking about the countless stories he had uncovered over the past few weeks, the stories of people whose lives had been ruined in the name of faith. The phone call had come unexpectedly, a polished voice on the other end offering an invitation to speak at Lakewood Church. "Pastor Joel would be honored if you could share your thoughts with our congregation," the assistant had said, her tone dripping with warmth. "Imagine how powerful it would be for 50,000 people to hear from someone of your integrity about the power of faith and blessings." Kennedy had been skeptical from the start. He knew how these things worked. Lakewood, like many megachurches, thrived on its message of prosperity. The promise of wealth, abundance, and divine favor for those who gave generously was a siren song that had pulled in millions. Kennedy wasn't fooled. He knew that true faith wasn't measured by a bank account, and this invitation wasn't as innocent as it appeared. He accepted, but not without a plan. What followed were days of research, hours spent poring over Joel Osteen's sermons, analyzing his teachings, and studying the financial reports of Lakewood Church. What Kennedy uncovered was disturbing. Behind the polished smile and the optimistic words of prosperity, there was a much darker reality. The church's wealth had grown exponentially, while its congregants, the very people who believed their faith would bring them fortune, were often left in financial ruin. Kennedy's investigation led him to stories of elderly women, like Margaret Chen, who had given everything in the belief that their faith would be rewarded. Margaret, an 82-year-old grandmother from Louisiana, had sent her last Social Security check to Lakewood for months, hoping that the promise of divine wealth would come through. But instead of blessings, she found herself evicted from her apartment. Her utilities shut off because she couldn't afford to pay them. She died alone in the cold with nothing to show for her sacrifices. Her granddaughter's letter to Kennedy had been haunting. "I thought God would take care of me if I took care of his preacher. The weight of Margaret's story sat heavily on Kennedy's heart. It wasn't just an isolated case, it was part of a disturbing pattern he had uncovered. A pattern of exploitation. People were being told that their financial hardships were a sign of spiritual failure, that their struggles could be overcome by giving more, sacrificing more. Kennedy had seen it before, systems built on lies and false promises. But this was different. This was faith being used as a weapon to control and manipulate. As he stood backstage at Lakewood, the weight of this knowledge pressed down on him. He wasn't just about to give a speech. He was about to confront a system that had preyed upon the most vulnerable. He had prepared himself for this moment, mentally and emotionally. But the moment he had feared was now upon him. The head of security approached him, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Kennedy, Pastor Joel has asked us to escort you out," the guard said, his voice low but firm. Kennedy could see the tension in the guard's eyes, a reflection of the unease that was spreading backstage. Kennedy took a deep breath. He wasn't surprised. He had expected resistance, but this was the moment he had prepared for, the moment when truth, when integrity, would be tested. "Tell Joel," Kennedy said, his voice steady. "I have a message for his people, and nothing is going to stop me from delivering it." The guard hesitated for a moment, clearly caught off guard by Kennedy's calm defiance. There was something in Kennedy's eyes that spoke not just of political resolve, but of a deeper moral certainty. This wasn't just about power or influence. This was about standing up for those who had been wronged, for those who had been manipulated into believing that their faith was a transaction. Kennedy could feel the weight of the moment. He wasn't just here to speak. He was here to expose the truth. And nothing, not security guards or a multi-million-dollar empire, was going to stop him. The tension backstage at Lakewood Church was palpable. The sound of footsteps echoed through. The corridors of security guards clad in dark suits moved with purpose, their eyes fixed on Kennedy, who stood calmly in the center of the room. The large sanctuary outside, filled with 50,000 people, was in stark contrast to the quiet intensity backstage. Kennedy's mind was clear, his purpose unwavering. This wasn't just another public appearance. It was the culmination of months of research, reflection, and moral reckoning. And now, as he faced the security team sent to remove him, he knew that nothing could stop him from delivering the truth. The head of security, a large man with a stern face, approached Kennedy with his hand raised, signaling for him to follow. "Mr. Kennedy, Pastor Joel has personally requested that you leave the premises. There's been a change of plans," he said, his voice professional, but with a hint of tension. He wasn't prepared for the man standing before him. Kennedy didn't flinch. His eyes locked onto the guards, unyielding. The senator's calm demeanor was like a shield, fortifying him against the intimidation tactics that had worked on others in the past. "I understand," Kennedy said, his voice steady. "But I have something important to say, and I'm not leaving until I've said it." He wasn't about to be swept aside, not when so many people had been left to suffer in silence. The guard hesitated. He wasn't used to this. People, when confronted by security at a megachurch like Lakewood, usually complied. But Kennedy wasn't just any guest. He wasn't here to be a puppet, reciting motivational speeches that hid the painful truths. He was here to challenge the very system that had led to so much pain. Kennedy's mind flashed back to the weeks leading up to this moment. After receiving the invitation from Osteen's assistant, he had immersed himself in everything Lakewood. He studied the church's financial reports. He watched sermon after sermon, and he read the testimonies of people whose lives had been destroyed by their faith in Osteen's promises. Families had emptied their savings accounts, convinced that their sacrifices would bring them divine prosperity. But instead of blessing, they had been met with eviction notices, homelessness, and broken promises. Kennedy's thoughts turned to Margaret Chen, the elderly woman from Louisiana, whose story had driven him to take action. Margaret had been a devout believer, a grandmother who had given her last Social Security check to Lakewood, hoping that her faith would be rewarded. But in the end, Margaret's trust had been shattered. She died alone in a cold apartment, her utilities cut off, her faith replaced with the bitter taste of betrayal. Margaret's granddaughter had sent Kennedy a letter detailing the heart-wrenching story. "I thought God would take care of me if I took care of his preacher," the letter read. Kennedy could still feel the weight of those words, their haunting resonance pushing him forward. It was this letter that had solidified his resolve. He wasn't just going to speak at Lakewood, he was going to expose the truth even if it meant standing alone. As the head of security continued to stand before him, Kennedy's voice remained calm but resolute. "Tell Joel that I have a message for his people. I've spent weeks uncovering the truth about what's happening here. I'm not leaving until I've spoken the truth about what this church has done to its followers." The guard's face hardened, but Kennedy could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. The senator was prepared for this. He had known that security would try to intimidate him, but he had also known that the truth would be stronger than any threat. The system had built its walls of wealth and influence on a foundation of lies, but Kennedy was here to tear them down. The air in the room grew thick with tension. The guard's radio crackled, and for a moment, Kennedy could hear the faint voice of Joel Osteen urging them to remove the senator. But the guards hesitated, unsure of how to proceed with a man who wasn't afraid of them or of the consequences. Kennedy had been in difficult situations before. This was nothing compared to the battles he had fought in the Senate, standing up for the powerless, challenging powerful interests. This, however, was personal. This was about the people who had been exploited by false promises. This was about the marginalized and the vulnerable, those who had been convinced that their faith could be measured by their financial contributions. The lead guard glanced at his colleagues, and there was a brief moment of silence. Then Kennedy reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The guard's eyes widened slightly, and Kennedy saw his fingers twitch in anticipation. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a threat. It was a letter, a message from Margaret, Chen's granddaughter. He unfolded the note and began to read aloud, his voice carrying the weight of her words. "My grandmother died believing God had forsaken her because Pastor Joel suggested that hardship stems from lack of faith. She gave her utility money to his ministry and suffered in the cold. Please tell people the truth." The words hung in the air like a bombshell. The guards froze, the tension shifting from physical confrontation to moral reckoning. Kennedy's voice remained steady, but there was a quiet power in the room that none of them had expected. "This is the truth," Kennedy said, looking each guard in the eye. "And you can't silence it. You can escort me out if you must, but Margaret Chen's story will be heard. And nothing is going to stop that." The guards exchanged uncertain glances. The weight of Kennedy's words had thrown them off balance. For the first time, they weren't sure how to proceed. The power of truth had cracked the facade of their authority. Kennedy had taken a moment of tension and transformed it into a moral high ground that left them questioning the system they were upholding. Kennedy stood tall, his resolve unbroken. His actions would soon echo far beyond these walls, but for now, he knew the fight was just beginning. The guards, visibly shaken by Kennedy's calm and unwavering demeanor, stood frozen in the backstage area. The heavy silence that had fallen was only broken by the distant hum of the church's sound system, the faint murmur of the crowd, and the soft buzz of the walkie-talkies. Kennedy's words had planted a seed of doubt in their minds, and for a brief moment they seemed to falter. The carefully orchestrated control that Lakewood Church had so carefully built, the image of prosperity and faith, was suddenly rattled by one man in his resolute stand for truth. As the tension lingered, Kennedy remained calm. He didn't rush to break the silence. He knew this moment wasn't about speed. It was about standing firm in his moral conviction, and he wasn't about to back down. The longer the silence stretched, the more the power shifted in his favor. The lead guard, unsure of what to do next, checked his earpiece once more. The voice on the other end, Joel Osteen's, crackled through the radio with a sense of urgency that couldn't be ignored. "Get him out of there, now." Kennedy heard the words clearly. Osteen was panicked. The message was simple. Remove the senator before he could speak, before his message could spread. Kennedy wasn't surprised. He knew Osteen's tactics. He had seen them from a distance for years. Manipulation masked as faith, a gospel that promised riches while leaving the poor in ruins. The very foundation of Lakewood's empire rested on the false promises of prosperity, and Kennedy had no intention of allowing it to continue unchecked. The guards, now visibly tense, advanced on him, their steps purposeful but hesitant. But, before they could act, Kennedy raised a hand and slowly pulled another folded sheet of paper from his jacket pocket. It was Margaret's granddaughter's letter again, the one that had driven him to this moment, the one that had become the catalyst for everything that was about to unfold. He unfolded the paper slowly, the delicate crack of the folds cutting through the heavy air. Without hesitation, he began to read aloud, his voice steady but filled with quiet intensity. My grandmother, Margaret Chen, was a kind and loving woman, Kennedy began. She was 82 years old and had spent her life caring for others. She believed in faith in God's promises, and she believed in Lakewood. She sent her entire Social Security check to the church, believing that her faith would unlock divine blessings. She thought that if she sacrificed, if she gave everything, God would take care of her. But instead, she was left to suffer. Alone, cold, her utilities cut off. And when she died, there was no miracle, no wealth, no prosperity, only the cold emptiness of broken promises. The room seemed to freeze in place. The guards remained motionless, their eyes fixed on Kennedy, but the usual confidence that came with their role had disappeared. They had heard plenty of speeches, plenty of preachers, but nothing like this. This wasn't just a man reading a note. This was a confrontation, an exposure of a truth they could no longer ignore. Kennedy paused for a moment, allowing the weight of the words to settle into the space. My grandmother believed that her poverty was a sign of her lack of faith. She believed that because she had been poor, she wasn't worthy of God's love. Pastor Joel, your ministry has made people believe that. And Margaret is not the only one. She's just one of many who have sacrificed their last dollars, their last hope, only to be left destitute. And now I'm here to tell you that I won't be silenced. Margaret's story deserves to be heard, and no one, not you, not your security team, will stop me from making sure the truth is known. As Kennedy spoke, the guards exchanged glances. They had expected resistance, perhaps anger or fear. But what they were witnessing now was something different. Kennedy wasn't fighting to be right. He was fighting for the truth. And that was something that neither Osteen nor his empire could easily dismiss. One of the younger guards, still trying to maintain authority, took a step forward. Mr. Kennedy, you need to leave now. Kennedy turned to face him directly, his eyes unwavering. I will leave when I've delivered my message. But understand this. The truth is already out there. Your boss can try to silence me, but the truth won't go away. Margaret's story and the stories of all those like her will not be buried. Kennedy's calm defiance was so powerful that it almost seemed to fill the room. His voice, his words, carried the weight of the suffering he had uncovered, the stories of loss and betrayal that Osteen's ministry had ignored. The guards were now clearly conflicted. On one hand, they had a job to do, a mission to uphold. But on the other, they were caught in a moral dilemma, one that Kennedy had placed them in. Their actions now held the potential to either perpetuate the lies of prosperity theology or to allow the truth to surface, even if it meant challenging their boss, their livelihood, and the very system they had been a part of. Kennedy took another step forward, moving past the guards and into the corridor that led toward the stage. He wasn't being physically escorted out. Instead, he was taking the reins of his own destiny, stepping forward with the moral authority he had earned over the years. The guards hesitated for a moment but allowed him to pass. It was as if they, too, recognized the inevitability of what was happening. The truth was powerful, and in this moment it was stronger than the walls that had been built around Lakewood Church. As Kennedy made his way toward the main hall, the security guards stood back, their resolve crumbling with each step he took. The senator was a man on a mission, and nothing was going to stop him now. He was going to deliver his message, and the world was going to hear it. The doors to the main sanctuary loomed ahead, and Kennedy's footsteps grew louder, each one echoing, like a drumbeat of defiance against the polished veneer of Lakewood's empire. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew that the fight had only just begun. The sound of Kennedy's footsteps grew louder as he made his way toward the entrance of the sanctuary. His calm, measured steps contrasted sharply with the rising storm in his chest. He was about to face not just a crowd of 50,000, but a world that had been conditioned to believe in a message of prosperity built on lies. Behind him, the security team stood at the ready, still unsure of how to respond to his quiet defiance. Kennedy knew that this was not just another speech. This was the moment he had been preparing for, the moment when truth would finally meet the polished facade of Lakewood Church. He wasn't interested in applause or accolades. He was interested in the truth being heard. And it would be heard, no matter what it took. As the heavy doors to the sanctuary swung open, Kennedy was greeted by a sea of faces. The congregation, a blend of eager believers, stood in anticipation of the latest sermon from Pastor Joel Osteen. The atmosphere was electric, filled with the hope and belief that today they would receive the financial blessings promised by the church. The usual message of prosperity filled the air, the idea that faith and wealth were intertwined, that the more you gave, the more you would receive in return. But today, that narrative was about to be shattered. Kennedy stepped into the light, his presence cutting through the glossy sermon that was unfolding before him. The congregation, initially unaware of the unfolding drama, shifted uneasily as they noticed the senator standing at the front of the stage. The voice of Joel Osteen faltered for a moment, his words dying in his throat as he saw Kennedy, uninvited, standing there with a determined look in his eyes. The crowd, sensing the tension, began to murmur. Kennedy didn't wait for permission to speak. He had no interest in the trappings of ceremony or the scripted politeness that often accompanied these moments. This was a confrontation, a battle between truth and deception. His voice, when it came, was calm but firm, carrying the weight of everything he had learned, everything he had uncovered, and everything he was about to expose. "Ladies and gentlemen," Kennedy began, his words steady but full of conviction, "I stand before you today with a message that I never expected to deliver, a message that I wish I didn't have to say, but one that I must. And that message is this: the prosperity gospel, the message that has been preached from this very pulpit, has misled you. It has promised you wealth, success, and blessings, but it has not delivered. Instead, it has left many of you in despair." There was a brief, stunned silence. The congregation, so accustomed to hearing Osteen's smooth words about faith and prosperity, now found themselves facing a different kind of truth. Kennedy's words, sharp and clear, cut through the carefully constructed narrative that had been built around Lakewood Church. Kennedy paused, allowing his words to sink in, before continuing. "I've spent the last few weeks researching the teachings of this church. I've spoken to the people who have given their last dollars, their last hope, to Lakewood, believing that their faith would bring them blessings. But instead of blessings, many of them found their lives ruined. People like Margaret Chen, an 82-year-old grandmother from Louisiana, who sent her Social Security checks to this church, believing that her faith would open the gates of heaven for her. Instead, she was left cold, alone, and destitute. Her story is not an isolated case. It is one of many." As Kennedy spoke, the crowd's murmurs grew louder, and some began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. They weren't sure how to react to this disruption. Could it really be true? Could the message they had believed in for so long be a lie? Kennedy's gaze swept across the room, making eye contact with individuals, trying to reach them on a human level, to make them understand the gravity of what he was saying. "The stories I've heard," Kennedy continued, "are heartbreaking. Families who have given everything to Lakewood in the hope of receiving divine blessings, only to be left in financial ruin. Elderly women like Margaret, who sent their last dollar to this ministry, believing that their sacrifices would be rewarded, only to end up homeless, cold, and alone. This is not the gospel of Christ. This is a perversion of faith." Kennedy's voice gained strength as he spoke, his words fueled by a deep sense of justice. This wasn't about politics. This wasn't about attacking a preacher. This was about standing up for the most vulnerable in society, those who had been taken advantage of in the name of faith. He turned to face the stage where Osteen stood, his face pale, his usual confidence gone. Osteen, who had built his empire on promises of prosperity, was now being forced to confront the consequences of those promises. "Pastor Joel," Kennedy said, his voice unwavering, "you have used your platform to teach people that their struggles are a result of their lack of faith. You have made them believe that if they give more, they will receive more. But what about the people who gave everything and received nothing in return? What about the elderly, the poor, the vulnerable, who believed your message only to be left destitute? What about them?" Osteen, visibly uncomfortable, gripped the podium tightly, trying to regain his composure. "John," he said, his voice strained, "you're taking this out of context. This is about faith. This is about giving. The Bible teaches that God rewards those who are faithful." Kennedy's gaze didn't waver. "No, Pastor Joel," he said firmly. "It's about justice. It's about protecting those who are vulnerable, those who have been misled. The Bible speaks of taking care of the poor, the widow, and the orphan. It speaks of justice for those who have been exploited. And yet here we are, in a place built on a lie, a place where the rich get richer, and the poor are told that their lack of wealth is a sign of their lack of faith." The congregation, once filled with anticipation for Osteen's words, now found themselves gripped by a different kind of message. Kennedy's words cut through the air like a knife, exposing the hypocrisy and greed that had been allowed to flourish in the name of faith. Some in the audience began to cry, others shifted uneasily, and a few even stood up, leaving their seats, unable to stay in the presence of a truth they could no longer ignore. Kennedy's voice softened as he continued. "This isn't about tearing down Lakewood or attacking Pastor Joel. This is about standing up for the truth. And the truth is that faith is not about wealth. It's not about money. It's about compassion, love, and justice. It's about helping those who need it most. It's about lifting people up, not exploiting them for profit." Kennedy's words hung in the air, and for the first time the room was still. Osteen stood motionless behind the podium, his facade cracking under the weight of Kennedy's truth. The cameras capturing the event broadcast it to millions of viewers, and the impact was immediate. Across the world, people began to question the very foundation of prosperity theology, asking themselves if the promises they had been sold were true or if they had been living a lie all along. Kennedy didn't wait for Osteen's response. He knew that there was no point in debating. The truth had been said and the real battle had just begun. He turned and walked off the stage, his heart heavy but resolute. He had done what he came to do. He had delivered the message, and nothing, no security guard, no preacher, was going to silence him. The silence in Lakewood's massive sanctuary was deafening. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped. The air was thick with uncertainty, a collective breath held by the tens of thousands who had witnessed something they hadn't expected, something that had torn through the heart of the message they had come to believe. As Kennedy made his way, off the stage, his footsteps steady and purposeful, a ripple of unease spread through the crowd. Some remained frozen in their seats, stunned by the direct confrontation that had just unfolded. Others whispered frantically to each other, unsure of how to process what they had just witnessed. And some, the more emotionally impacted, could be seen wiping tears from their eyes, their faith shaken to its very core. Osteen stood motionless behind the podium, the charismatic energy that normally flowed so effortlessly from him, now replaced by an unsettling silence. His perfectly styled hair seemed to sag under the weight of the moment, his posture stiff with a mixture of disbelief and anxiety. For years, he had built an empire on the promises of prosperity, teaching people that their financial sacrifices would bring them divine favor. But now, faced with the cold, hard truth that Kennedy had just exposed, Osteen's mask had cracked. Kennedy, walking with the quiet resolve of a man who had just completed a moral mission, made his way to the back of the sanctuary. The security guards, who had once stood poised and ready to remove him, now seemed impotent in the face of the senator's defiance. They looked on as he passed, a quiet acknowledgement of the weight of the truth that had just been delivered. Kennedy entered the backstage area, where he was greeted by the same head of security who had attempted to escort him out earlier. The man who had once carried the authority of his position now looked unsure, his confidence faltering. "Mr. Kennedy," he said, his voice soft, You did what you came here to do." Kennedy paused, looking the man in the eyes. "No," he replied, his voice measured and firm. "What I came here to do was to speak the truth. What happens next is up to everyone in that room, and everyone watching on television." The security guard nodded, still processing the weight of the moment. It was clear that the confrontation had shaken him to his core. He had never imagined that a simple request to escort a guest out would turn into something that could challenge the very core of the message they had been upholding. Outside, the cameras had been rolling, capturing every moment of the event. The tension between Kennedy and Osteen was palpable, broadcast to millions. The footage of the confrontation was already circulating on social media, igniting discussions across the country. The world was watching, and the impact was immediate. Kennedy didn't care about the headlines or the viral videos. He wasn't interested in celebrity or fame. What mattered to him now was the ripple effect of the truth he had just shared. He had come to Lakewood to confront the exploitation of vulnerable people who had been manipulated by promises of divine wealth. He had come to expose the hollow core of a system that preyed on those most in need. As Kennedy sat down backstage, the enormity of what had just transpired began to settle in. He wasn't just a politician anymore. He was a voice for the voiceless, a protector of those who had been misled. Margaret Chen's story and the stories of so many others had been given the attention they deserved. But the battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Across the country, people began to talk. News outlets picked up the story, questioning the legitimacy of the prosperity gospel and its widespread influence. But the real conversation began with the people, those who had been exploited, those who had given everything in the hope of receiving blessings that never came. Social media erupted with comments from those who had lost their faith in Lakewood's message. Stories poured in from all corners of the nation, stories of financial ruin, shattered beliefs, and broken promises. In the days that followed, Kennedy received messages from all over. Many were from people who had been following Lakewood's teachings for years, individuals who had believed in Osteen's promises and had seen their lives unravel because of it. Some were angry, furious that they had been misled for so long. Others were heartbroken, realizing that they had been taken advantage of in the name of faith. But there were also messages of gratitude, messages from people who felt that, for the first time, someone had stood up for them. Kennedy knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. The powers that be would fight back, as they always did when their empire was threatened. Osteen and his team would try to spin the narrative, to claim that Kennedy had misunderstood, that his words were taken out of context. They would attempt to regain control of the message and deflect the growing scrutiny. But Kennedy wasn't worried about that. He had already won. The truth had been spoken, and that was a victory in itself. Back in the sanctuary, Osteen finally regained his composure. His speech, once filled with the promise of financial blessing, now seemed hollow. He stumbled over his words, struggling to steer the sermon back on track. The cameras continued to roll, capturing his discomfort. The congregation, once captivated by his message of prosperity, was now divided. Some sat in stunned silence. Others whispered urgently to one another, and a few began to leave their seats, visibly shaken by the truth that had just been revealed. It wasn't long before Osteen's security team received a message from their boss. The situation needed to be contained. But the damage had already been done. The truth had pierced the polished veneer of Lakewood's empire, and the cracks were beginning to show. The prosperity gospel, once seen as an unquestionable pillar of faith, was now under intense scrutiny. In the days that followed, Kennedy continued his mission. He met with reporters, attended town halls, and spoke to those who had been directly impacted by the teachings of prosperity theology. He didn't let the controversy distract him. He focused on the people who had been hurt by Lakewood's false promises. He urged them to speak out, to share their stories, and to demand accountability. Kennedy's efforts soon sparked a wider movement, a call for transparency and accountability within religious institutions that preached the prosperity gospel. The truth Kennedy had exposed spread like wildfire, and it began to shift the narrative. People started questioning the legitimacy of leaders who had profited from their followers' sacrifices. And while Osteen and Lakewood remained steadfast in their defense of prosperity theology, they could no longer ignore the growing public outcry. As the months passed, Kennedy's name became synonymous with standing up for truth, justice, and integrity in the face of powerful systems of exploitation. He had challenged the status quo and, in doing so, had started a conversation that would continue for years to come. The battle was far from over, but Kennedy knew that he had done what was right. The lights in Lakewood Church may have dimmed that day, but the truth had shone brighter than ever before, and Kennedy had become a beacon for those who were no longer willing to accept lies in the name of faith. As the weeks passed, the storm caused by Kennedy's confrontation at Lakewood Church continued to grow. What had started as a single moment of moral clarity had sparked a firestorm that reverberated across the nation. The images of Kennedy standing before Osteen, calling out the lies of prosperity theology, were seared into the minds of millions. News outlets, social media platforms, and church communities all engaged in a heated debate. Some called Kennedy a hero, a champion for the oppressed, while others branded him a troublemaker, a politician using his platform to attack a beloved preacher. But despite the divisive reactions, one thing was clear: the conversation had changed. Kennedy received hundreds of messages in the days after his appearance, emails, letters, phone calls, many from people who had been hurt by Lakewood's teachings. These were the voices of the forgotten and the downtrodden, people who had believed in the promises of wealth and prosperity, only to be left destitute and disillusioned. For years, they had been told that their financial struggles were the result of their lack of faith, that their poverty was a punishment for not giving enough. But now, for the first time, someone had stood up and told them they weren't alone. Someone had spoken the truth, and it had resonated with them in a way that no sermon ever could. One evening, Kennedy sat in his office reflecting on the magnitude of what had transpired. The phone buzzed on his desk, breaking the stillness. It was a message from a woman named Clara Mitchell, a mother of two who had sent her last paycheck to Lakewood in the hope of receiving financial blessings. In her email, she described how she had nearly lost her home after following the teachings of prosperity gospel, all the while believing that God would provide if she just gave enough. She thanked Kennedy for giving her the courage to speak out about her experience and for shining a light on the exploitation that had torn apart her life. Clara's message wasn't unique. In fact, it was a reflection of the countless others who had lived in silence, afraid to speak out for fear of being judged for their faith. But now, they had found their voice. Kennedy knew that this was just the beginning. The truth about prosperity theology needed to be heard by even more people. It needed to be addressed on a larger scale, on a national stage where it could no longer be ignored. That's when Kennedy decided to take his fight to Washington. He organized a series of hearings on the exploitation of religious communities by televangelists and prosperity gospel preachers. His aim wasn't to attack religion, but to call for greater transparency and accountability from institutions that claimed to represent faith. He invited scholars, former followers of prosperity preachers, and experts on religious freedom to testify about the ways in which these churches used their power to manipulate and exploit their congregations. The hearings were broadcast live, and soon millions were watching as the truth about Lakewood and others like it was laid bare. The testimonies were devastating. Former members of prosperity churches spoke about the emotional and financial toll of being part of a system that promised wealth but delivered nothing but debt and despair. They spoke about the psychological abuse, the shame they had been made to feel when they couldn't give enough, and the disillusionment that followed when their lives didn't improve as promised. Kennedy listened to their stories, his heart heavy with empathy. He had already known the damage that prosperity theology had done, but hearing it directly from those who had lived through it made it all the more real. Each story was a painful reminder of how vulnerable people could be when they were desperate for hope. In the weeks following the hearings, calls for reform began to grow louder. Legislators on both sides of the aisle, many of whom had remained silent on the issue, started to take notice. Some even joined Kennedy in calling for stronger regulations on religious organizations that use their influence to manipulate congregants. It wasn't just about holding one preacher accountable. It was about protecting the millions of people who had been preyed upon by the false promises of prosperity gospel. But despite the growing momentum, Kennedy knew that the battle wasn't over. He still had to contend with the powerful forces behind the prosperity gospel, people who had built their empires on the backs of vulnerable believers. Joel Osteen and his allies would not go down without a fight, and fight they did. Lakewood Church issued a statement vehemently denying any wrongdoing. They accused Kennedy of misrepresenting their message and attempting to tarnish their reputation. They even went as far as to claim that the senator's actions were politically motivated, an attempt to undermine the faith of millions of their followers. Osteen, appearing on national television, defended his ministry, insisting that the teachings of prosperity gospel were based on biblical principles and that those who gave were indeed rewarded by God. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the truth would be drowned out by the powerful media machine that Lakewood controlled. But Kennedy wasn't backing down. He knew that the power of the truth wasn't something that could be easily dismissed. He doubled down, speaking out on television and at rallies, continuing to call attention to the damage caused by prosperity theology. The fight reached a boiling point when a group of former Lakewood members filed a class action lawsuit against the church, alleging fraud and emotional distress. The lawsuit, which sought to hold the church accountable for its deceptive teachings, quickly gained national attention. Kennedy offered his full support to the plaintiffs, publicly backing their efforts to seek justice. Lakewood responded by hiring high-priced attorneys and launching a counterattack, accusing Kennedy of grandstanding and using the legal system for political gain. The battle became bitter, with both sides exchanging barbs in the media. But Kennedy's resolve never wavered. He was no longer just a senator. He was a moral leader, standing up for the vulnerable, the exploited, and the silenced. Months passed, and the legal and political battles continued to rage. But through it all, Kennedy kept his focus on the people whose lives had been ruined by the teachings of prosperity gospel. He met with them, listened to their stories, and gave them a platform to speak. His efforts, his commitment to justice, and his unwavering belief in the power of truth began to shift the public conversation. And then, one day, after nearly a year of tireless work, a settlement was reached. Lakewood Church agreed to pay a Bowery, substantial sum to the former members who had filed the lawsuit, and the church's financial practices were placed under much closer scrutiny. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was a step toward accountability. Kennedy stood in front of the media, the weight of the moment settling over him. He had done it. He had stood up for the vulnerable, exposed the lies, and forced the powerful to answer for their actions. It wasn't just about the church, though. It was about restoring faith in justice, in the power of truth, and in the belief that no one, no matter how powerful, was above accountability. As Kennedy walked away from the press conference, he knew the battle was far from over. There were still those who clung to the lies, still those who refused to see the truth. But in that moment, he felt a sense of peace. He had done what was right, and that was enough. Months had passed since the courtroom drama and the battle, for justice had settled into a quiet victory. The settlement reached between Lakewood Church and the former members was a crucial moment, but it wasn't the end. For Senator John Kennedy, the real work had only just begun. Though Lakewood's prosperity gospel teachings would continue to influence millions, the truth had been exposed. Kennedy's stand had ignited a nationwide conversation about the ethical boundaries of faith-based wealth building, and religious institutions were now under increased scrutiny. The public wasn't just asking questions, they were demanding answers. Kennedy had become a symbol of moral integrity in a world that often seemed to reward the powerful and exploit the vulnerable. His name was now associated with standing up for what was right regardless of the cost. He had risked his career, reputation, and safety, but his moral compass had remained intact. He had faced down not only a multi-million-dollar institution, but an ideology that had shaped the lives of so many. But even as the cameras faded and the media shifted focus, Kennedy knew that change wasn't just about the headlines. It was about the lasting impact on the people whose lives had been changed by his actions. The phone calls, the letters, the thank you messages continued to pour in. The very people who had once been silenced by guilt and fear were now speaking out, emboldened by Kennedy's actions. They were no longer afraid to share their stories, to stand up for themselves, and to challenge the system that had manipulated them. At a quiet town hall in Louisiana, Kennedy stood before a small crowd of his constituents who had supported him throughout his journey. A young woman, her voice shaking with emotion, stood up and said, "You gave us a voice. You made us believe that the truth could win." Her words, though simple, carried a weight that Kennedy would never forget. He nodded, his heart swelling, with pride and gratitude. It had never been about the applause or the media attention. It was always about empowering those who had been forgotten. He had done what he came to do, but the fight for justice continued. The lessons of that battle, however, would stay with him for the rest of his life. As he walked out of the town hall that evening, Kennedy looked up at the Louisiana sky. The stars were brighter than ever, and in that moment, he felt a deep sense of peace. He had faced the darkness, and though the road ahead was long, he knew that in the end, it was worth it. Moral of the story. The story of John Kennedy's stand against prosperity theology is one of integrity, courage, and moral clarity. It reminds us that in the face of injustice, whether in religion, politics, or any other arena, one voice grounded in truth can change the world. Kennedy's commitment to exposing the manipulation of the vulnerable and demanding accountability from those in power serves as a beacon for anyone willing to stand up for what is right no matter the cost. It teaches us that true faith is not measured by wealth but by compassion, empathy, and the willingness to protect those who cannot protect themselves.